I'm Jessie, the Sleepy Koala. Happy New Year's, everybody. This is not my first video to go out since New Year's, but it is the first one I am recording as of 2022. So to me, it feels like the first video of the new year. I'm now back from my parents-in-law's place up in Portland, Oregon. It was really, really nice to get away, and though I did really miss my cats. I really missed my cats. They stayed home while we went away because we just couldn't take them with us, and we had a friend look after them for us, which was incredibly generous of her and really, really lovely. While I was away, I was able to do quite a bit of reading, which was really quite nice. And I got through one book and started a couple more. I didn't finish anything else, I don't believe, but there was a lot of long car journeys where I got to read in the car because my husband was driving. Though this is not the video that I talk about what I'm reading in January. This is the video where I talk about what I have read in December instead. Today, I am going to go through the books that I read in December of 2021 and to see how I capped out and finished off the year. First up, we will start with The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. I finished this book over Christmas. I love this book. This book is an okay book. Everyone, I think, would agree, Brandon included, that this is the worst Mistborn book and maybe Brandon's worst Cosmere book. He is well aware of the flaws of this book, and I think a lot of them jump out to readers as we read through them. This book is only really okay until the ending, and then the ending is excellent, and it is honestly so good that it drags a book from a 3-star to a 4-star. That is how good the ending of this book is. Everything comes together so well. It is thrilling, it is tense, you're on the edge of your seat for so long. The payoffs are so gratifying in this book. They just take forever to get to. And that's the biggest flaw of this book. So much time is spent on setup, and it's not the most interesting setup either. It's necessary for the plot later to happen as it does, but it's just a bit boring. And it's just a bit dull. And every time I've read this, I get to the end of part 2 and breathe a sigh of relief. Because I know in my heart of hearts that the dull bit, the setup bit, is done. Well, at least mostly done. Things are gonna start happening from part 3 onwards. So even if there's more setup, it's balanced out by payoffs. And good God, do we need a payoff by the point that we get to in part 3. But once we get there, the payoffs are great. They are 100% worth the time and effort to get through the start of this book. And I'm not saying that the start of this book is unenjoyable. It's just less enjoyable than the first one. So if you're going directly from the first one into this one, it feels like a slog because you've just gone from this tense, high action, fast-paced ending of the first book into this really slow swamp of setting things up. And again, it is worth it. By the time you get to part 3, things start kicking over and you start getting the payoffs, and the ending of this book is brilliant. It's so good and definitely worth it. And also, I am not a fan of open endings. This book has a great open ending. I love that this book caps off what the essence of this book is. It finishes this story and then it gives you that plot hook for the next book, and oh boy, is it a plot hook that it leaves you with. It's brilliant. It's brilliantly done, and it almost amuses me that probably one of Brandon's worst Cosmere books has one of his best open endings in it as well. Overall, I would probably rate this a 3-star book that is dragged up to 4 stars purely based on the ending. And I love reading it every single time. It is well worth the wait, and I anticipate it and look forward to it. I was very interested starting this book. There's a particular character called Zane that my husband hates, and it is a little bit divisive in the fan community of whether you hate him or you don't hate him. And I actually really enjoyed him this time around. I've never hated this character. I've always enjoyed him to an extent, but I really enjoyed him this time. I really enjoyed everything to do with Zane this time. And I think it's because some other things in the book finally clicked in place for me as to how things fit together, whereas before it was a bit more murky in my mind, and I think that's part of what drags Zane down. But now that that stuff is clicked, Zane, I'm just like, you're a delight. I just want to keep reading you, you psychopathic little monster. Some other things that I wasn't the biggest fan of in this book, there is communication issues, which make complete sense. In the book, they just drag on too long for me. They get to a point where I just wanted to pull my hair out in frustration, because even though it all makes sense, it's still frustrating, and it was to the point that it was unenjoyable to read for me. But they got past it eventually, and things moved on, which was nice. And I'm glad that these communication issues are not going to be dragged into the next book. I would be very frustrated if that had just been dragged out. And I think maybe another author writing this book might have, for the sake of character and plot drama. But good God, I'm so glad that Sanderson ended that and didn't continue it, because that would have driven me nuts. Overall, this is a solid book. I enjoy it, and I highly recommend the Mistborn trilogy. It's fantastic. And even if you do struggle with this one, know the third book is well worth it. The third book is fantastic. And getting through this one, even if you're not the biggest fan of it, the next one is worth the push. Switching from a book that I liked to a book that I distinctly disliked, The Art of French Kissing. I regret finishing this book. After finishing this book, I looked back on my reading time and felt like I had wasted it by reading this book instead of reading something else. I didn't enjoy this. The main character was awful in this book. She is a really terrible person, and I couldn't figure out if the narrative wanted to admit that or not. Sometimes it feels like it's going to, and that it's trying to agree that, yes, the way she acts is not okay. But then there's other parts that just blatantly make it sound like what she's doing is perfectly normal and natural, and not just being incredibly selfish and a bit toxic towards the people around her. And she is. That frustrated me, because I don't have an issue with the main character being an awful person. What I have an issue with is when a book refuses to acknowledge that that's not okay and pushes it as if it's something natural. Because at that point, you're sending the message that acting in this way is completely normal and you should totally do it, and you can treat people this way and it's fine. And I don't think the book is written in a way that shows that this is a work of fiction and people shouldn't model themselves after it. I think it gives the impression that, no, it's totally fine to be like this. Other people's feelings don't matter. Yours are more important. And I don't like that message. I don't think that's a good message that this book should be sending. In terms of the plot, I enjoyed all of the baking stuff. This is set as part of a cooking show. There's a bunch of teenagers who are competing for a scholarship. And the cooking challenges were actually pretty fun to read. It was interesting to see that translated onto paper, because it's such a visual thing, and I'm so used to seeing it visually instead of having it as written prose. It worked pretty well in written format, so I think that was quite well done. The love interest Reed, I started out thinking he was also a pretty bad person, but he actually does quite a lot to redeem himself in this book, and by the end, all I could think is that Reed deserves so much better than Carter. And really, going into a relationship with her was something that wasn't gonna go well because of the way that she treats people around her, including him. Some of her worst infractions are towards him, and she's just being completely unreasonable and like going off and yelling at him and being angry at him for things that it's not fair for her to do so. So by the end of the book, I was actually pretty behind Reed's character. He was sympathetic, he was empathetic, he knew how to say sorry and mean it, and he just overall was actually a pretty nice person outside of the douchebaggery that he does at the very beginning. So he's the best character in this book, and he deserves much better than the main character. Next up, we have got more Chobits. I read volumes 4 and 5. This is volume 6 because I've already given the other ones back to the library. I read volumes 4 and 5 this month, and I'm losing steam on this manga. nothing's really happening. It feels like we're just wading through a swamp or something. It's very slow. And I know that these are short volumes and not much always happens in them, but I feel like nothing has really happened to move along the plot. There is some other stuff going on with other characters on the side, and that's pretty interesting. I do want to know what's happening with the bakery manager and Yumi. That is intriguing, considering I'm pretty sure she's a high schooler and he is freshly widowed and quite a bit older than her. But this book has multiple romances where there is quite a bit of an age difference, and one of them is a teenager. So I am not surprised by this, nor is it uncommon so far in this series. But nothing's happening. We had this sort of side plot which didn't go very far, where Chi is kidnapped, but it doesn't move anything along. It barely achieves anything in the plot except to kind of move things sideways. And I just want to know more about the actual central plot of this and what's going on with Chi and who she is and where she comes from. And I'm not getting that currently, and I really would like to be getting that, because that's the interesting part of this book. We do get more of the in-world storybooks that Chi likes, and I find them a bit confusing, honestly. Like, I get that they're meant to be a reflection of her and Hideki's relationship and Chi's place in the world, but just the way that they're written, I am not following them very well, except for the basic premise that is following along with what she is doing. But we do find out who the author of these are and why they are matching Hideki and Chi's life so well, and that was cool. I did enjoy that reveal. So I will keep going with the volumes I have. I've got volumes 6 and 7 still, and then that was all that the library had when I first got them out. I have no idea if they have anything after that. But if volume 6 and 7 don't really pick up, I'm not sure if I want to keep reading after that. Like, I want to do a Clamp reread. I want to read all of Clamp, or at least, like, the Clamp series that I'm interested in, and this was one I was interested in, so I would like to keep going. I just have no motivation to pick up these books at the moment, so it's kind of hard to continue on in that case. The other physical book that I read this month was Caraval, which I adored. I read this right at the start of the month, and it just missed my November wrap-up. This was a really sweet story that was full of magic and whimsy. I loved following the main character Scarlet, and just her relationship with Julian immediately clicked for me, and I was immediately behind it. There's just some tropes that were put into play that I love. I love them so much, and I was here for it from the beginning. The idea of Caraval as well was really intriguing. I still am a bit unclear as to how this is a game and what exactly is being played, because Scarlet does a bunch of things that seem to be out of bounds, but yet she still wins by doing these things. The other characters in this book are also delightful. I love Scarlet's sister Donatella. She is really fun to read, and I very much enjoyed seeing her in this book and seeing what she was going through as the damsel in distress. I did find some of the characterization to be a little bit two-dimensional, but at the same time, for a book that is meant to be this whimsical, magical land, I'm not expecting really in-depth, deep, three-dimensional real characters. I was expecting characters that were fun and enjoyable and did their purpose, and that was all that they needed to have. And I got that. This book gave me that. In terms of the plot, initially I wasn't the biggest fan of the ending until I got right to the end. And then that changed my perspective of the entire second half of the book, which I felt was a little bit two-dimensional and a little bit too plot trope heavy, and there just wasn't much depth to it. But then I finished the book, and the end of it recontextualized things for me. And I suddenly, with this new lens, it made it so much better. And I don't normally like this type of stuff. I think books should stand on their own and not have to be recontextualized to be good. But just the way this one was done, and the way it was set up and the reasoning behind it made it worth it. That made it for me. It made it good, and I loved it, and it changed my entire view of the book in the end. I was thinking Caraval was maybe like a 3-star book. I'm liking it, but it could be better. And then the ending happened, and I'm like, 4 stars. This is a 4-star book. This was great. I loved it. I think this was done really well, and things were plotted and put together really well and slotted into place. I did find that it took me a while to get into Scarlett's character. I understand that the point of her character at the beginning is that she is hesitant and she is fearful and afraid of doing things and taking risks and putting herself out there. I felt it went on for a little bit too long, and it made it just a little bit too annoying. But she got there in the end, and I ended up loving her character so much. I do absolutely love the magic as well in this. There is no rhyme or reason to it. There is no rules here. This is not a hard magic system at all. Anything can happen and everything will happen, and it was just really fun to see what happens when there are no rules and the people that work at Caraval can just do whatever they want and magically do what they want. It was magical. I loved it. I loved how dramatic this book was. It was fast-paced. It was really fun to read, and I really liked this book. The last physical book that I read in December was actually a DNF in the end. It's Raybearer. I couldn't get into this book. I found it to be very slow, and I wasn't sure where the plot was going. I feel like this was trying to be a very character-heavy book, but in the first part, it didn't grab me enough with the characters and flesh them out to a point that I was really attached to them, that the plot didn't matter. And because I couldn't find the plot in this book and wasn't attached to the characters, there wasn't really much going for me. I got through to the end of part 1, I think, where what is in the synopsis of this book ends, and the synopsis is just the first part of this book. I have no idea what's going to come next, so I have no idea what to expect, or even something to kind of hold on to of, okay, well, this is going to happen, so I have to wait and see for that to happen. It just kind of meandered out and felt like nothing was really going on, and it was a bit directionless, and if I'd kept reading, I'm sure something would have come up eventually. But after reading The Art of French Kissing and regretting what felt like wasted time in the end, I didn't really want to continue with this because I didn't want to feel that way again. And I didn't want to continue with a book that might get better, but I'm currently not enjoying. So I DNF this book, and I might pick it up again in future. I think it will help in future that I've read the start of this, so at least I know what ground has been covered and getting through that instead of it feeling like I'm being given a building block every chapter but having no overall picture of where I should be putting that block. So I didn't finish this, and I know a lot of people really like this book and say really good things about it. I don't think it was for me. I might try to get it in the future, I'm not sure, but if I do, it might be a bit easier because I've read the start of it. On to the non-physical books that I read in December. First we have The Flight Girls, which I listened to on audiobook. This book was delightful. I actually put this down as a comfort read for a reading challenge that I did in December because of just how heartwarming and wonderful this book was. And it is fully a comfort read. It was really wonderful. It does so well at portraying not just love, but also loss and sorrow and grief and how it can affect a person. And there's just some beautiful prose in this book with descriptions of grief and loss. Right near the beginning, when Pearl Harbor is first bombed, we get these scenes of Audrey trying to get back to her house and to find her friends, and it's heart-wrenching. And it's just written so very well. It's masterfully written. It gives off so much emotion. I find that there are 2 different grief emotion reactions that you can generally get in a book. Firstly is when you as a reader grieve a character. for that character going through things or dying or whatever it may be. And then there's the grief that comes from the other characters grieving a character that has passed on or is going through things. This book does perfectly at both of these. We get the scenes where we have to grieve directly for a character. I found myself at one point listening to this section sobbing while standing in the shower because I was so emotionally upset in terms of what was happening in the book. But then we also have times where we watch other characters grieve, and the way that that grief is written is enough to pull at my own heartstrings and make me feel incredibly sad and upset as well. The way it treats love as well is interesting and I think also sad in its own way. We have our two characters, Audrey and James, who click immediately, and they know that they click and they know that they're the ones for each other. But yet, they also both know that they don't want to give up their lives, and they have very conflicting goals and very conflicting paths that they want to go down. So instead of throwing it away to be together, they decide, no, what we have now as individuals is more important than a potential relationship. And that is not something that is commonly seen in books where you have this insta-love type situation happening. But you can see through all of their interactions, through all of their letters as the book progresses, when they're just considering each other friends, just how much love is still there, and it never disappears, even when things start getting hard in the war for James. And it is heartbreaking watching Audrey get less and less letters and not knowing why, and going through this heartbreak of her own, because even though they weren't together, it still breaks her heart to feel that he is pulling away or that he is disappearing from her life, because he meant so much to her even though they were never together as a couple. But jumping off that, another thing that this book does brilliantly, this book was so good, I really enjoy talking about this. Audrey is a character who never needed romantic love in her life. She found it with James, but as I just pointed out, they chose their own paths. They chose not to be together. And James was the same when he talked to Audrey and said that he didn't need a relationship in his life to function and to continue onwards. That just wasn't a priority of his. Hence why they were able to make this decision in the first place. But Audrey is a character that we focus on in terms of her love life in this book. And it's pointed out again and again. Not only is she incredibly independent and does not need someone else there to provide assistance and support in the form of a romantic partner, she actively doesn't want one. She is entirely fine being single and just having her friendships. And we get so many characters bring up, but what about that person that you come home to at night? And she is fine with not having that person. She is fine with the idea of going home and being by herself and not needing someone there to greet her. And this is definitely a personality type that I do not see very much in books, and is one that I personally vibe with quite a lot, because before I was with my husband, I was perfectly happy being single. I was not looking for a relationship, and the fact that I ended up in a relationship with my husband was a coincidence and happened out of nowhere. I wasn't looking for a relationship at the time. It was just an online conversation that started between us, and then the rest is history. But I was perfectly happy being single. I had my friends and I didn't need something more. So having a character in a book who is the exact same as me, who also doesn't have that strong desire to be in a romantic relationship and is just content with her life as it is, with having friendships, with having familiar relationships and not needing that extra one, that was great. I really enjoyed seeing that. So I really vibed well with Audrey as a character and really got invested in what she chose to do, because everything that happens with James is what happened with Eric and me. Not the actual circumstances of choosing not to be together even though you are in love with each other, that obviously didn't happen. But the idea that you meet someone and immediately click and they are the exception to this feeling of not needing to have a relationship and not looking for one. One day someone comes out of the blue and steps into your life and they fill that spot that didn't need filling, but that you are now happy to have filled. And that's what it felt like with Audrey and James as well. They clicked together. They were perfect together, but they didn't need someone to fill a space because that space was created for them in particular. So I absolutely adored Audrey as a character, particularly that part of her characterization. Now that I have talked about the characters for a long time, in terms of the plot of this book, it goes along at a pretty steady pace until the ending, where it just ramps up really quickly and just like presses the gas pedal and goes so fast right at the end. So it's got some pacing issues, and I also wish that some of the characters that were introduced at the very beginning actually continued throughout the story, because it felt like we were given this group of people and it came across to be like, these were the group of people that we needed to care about in this book. And then some of them just kind of disappeared and didn't stick around. So I kind of wish that had happened. But really, the biggest criticism I have of this book is that the pacing is a bit off. Everything else just felt perfect. I gave this a 5-star, even with the pacing issues, because it was just so well done on the character front and the relationship front that I just couldn't not give it 5 stars. It was totally worth it. It was a gorgeous story. It was interesting, and the characters were incredibly well-rounded. I love this book so much. I highly recommend this book to everyone. This was such a fun book. I don't know if it was meant to be a romance story itself, even though it had a lot of romance in it, but it was such a good World War II era book about how women fit in society as well. And I loved it and highly recommend it. The last book that I read in the month of December, scraped in right at the very end, and that is Evershore, the new book by Brandon Sanderson and Janci Patterson. This is the 3rd Skyward Flight novella, and it completes the triplet of novellas that have been released concurrent to the 3rd book, Cytonic. That was a mouthful. I read this book twice, and I had different reactions on each read. The first one, I thought it was incredible. I loved every moment of it, and I loved everything that happened. It was incredibly fast-paced. There was so much going on. There was amazing character work in it. We had so much with the POV character of Jorgen, and it was just such a good book to read. The second time I read it, all of this was still true, except I felt like the ending was crammed. It didn't jump out to me as much my first time through, and I think it was the adrenaline of, we have a new book, what's gonna happen, it's the last one, it's gonna have a big climax, and it did. It had a very big climax. I kind of think it was a little bit too big at a certain point. We had so many things that happened one after another in the ending that were massive on their own. Any one of these things could have been an ending by itself, and we had something like 4 of them in one book, one after another. And my problem with this is that it feels like the dramatization and the scope of any of those given endings has to be cut down because we immediately have to move on to another thing. And it feels like things got squished in a little bit too much. It's to the point that one of the things that happened was also a climactic point in another book. So another book used this one thing as one of its giant climactic points, and this book shoves it in there with 3 or 4 other things. And they're all kind of like that. They could be their own climax, but we have 4 of them. And I guess they're kind of mini climaxes, but because any of these could be bigger on their own, it feels like we're having to just squish them down. and contain them and not give them space and the page time to really bloom into what would be a fantastic ending on its own. So that's my criticism of the book, is that the ending is cramped with things that really deserve more space and time individually. But in saying that, all of these individual things were awesome. And there is one particular thing that happens in the book that was incredible, and I loved it so much. And the thing is, based on stuff in Cytonic, you can kind of guess that this thing will happen or might happen, and it did not in any way detract from that moment in particular. That moment was still the highlight of the book for me, and I loved every moment of it, and I was just thrilled reading it. And that's the thing, is I was still thrilled reading through the second time, and I still enjoyed the book immensely. I love the new characters that we meet. Juno is a standout cinnamon roll, and I think that everyone is probably going to agree with me on that. There is at least one thing that I think we need to take with a bit of grain of salt to be able to accept it, but it's a YA series. That's okay. Sometimes things are going to happen that we just suspend the disbelief, and that's okay. And I do think there was at least one thing in this book that was like that, and it didn't detract from the book for me. I don't want to think about it too in detail, because then my brain goes, maybe this was a bit silly, and I just want to enjoy the book as it is. But overall, this was a really good book. It was a great capstone to the Skyward Flight trilogy, and is a great companion book to Cytonic as well. With these Skyward Flight novellas, I would say they are absolutely 100% non-negotiable essential to this series before you read the fourth book, Defiant. If you don't read these novellas, there is just a whole bunch of stuff that has happened that you just don't know what's happened or why it has happened. And I do not think that you could skip these, and it's kind of hard because a lot of the time novellas are treated as kind of a side thing to the main book series. Whereas these ones, it really feels like the third book is the trilogies and Cytonic. It's those 4 books in one is the third book of this quadrilogy. And I think you will need both Cytonic and all 3 novellas to really understand what the hell is going on when we get to Defiant. Which won't be for quite a while, but I am very excited for it still. Even though I have had such mixed feelings on this series as a whole, I am still so excited for this last book, because I think it's going to give me everything that I have wanted for books 2 and 3. Book 4, I am holding out that book 4 gives me all of the crossovers that I have been hoping for, and the way that we end things in Cytonic and the way we end things in Evershore, I think I will get what I want. There is one other book that I was going to read this month, but I didn't. And I wanted to mention it because I specifically brought it up that I was going to read it over Christmas as a Christmassy book. That is A Christmas Carol. And I didn't. I didn't read this because I got to Christmas and I just did not feel like reading that book. And I decided to go with my mood instead and to pick up a book that I knew I would enjoy. Whereas I think trying to force myself to read that book, I would not have enjoyed it as much, and it wasn't worth it just so I could read something Christmassy over Christmas and on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. So those were all the books that I read in the month of December. And there were quite a few of them. I am surprised that I read that many books all at once, with Christmas coming up as well. But hey, okay. Let's see if I can read as many next month, I guess. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. What did you read this month? What are your thoughts on these books? Like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time. Bye!